What if I told you that Hitler didn't lose the war in Berlin or at Stalingrad, but deep underground, where black gold is hidden? The Third Reich was suffocating without fuel, like an athlete without oxygen. Today, we will reveal one of the most secret pages of World War II, how the USSR deprived Germany of what turns tanks into scrap metal, planes into museum exhibits, and great armies into walking crowds. This is a story about a war that was fought not only on the battlefields, but also in oil wells, chemical plants, and fuel tanks. A war that determined the fate of the world. Oil became the blood of the 20th century. Without it, tanks turned into piles of metal, planes became museum exhibits, and the fleet became floating targets. By the beginning of World War II, all the leading powers of the world understood this, but especially Germany and the Soviet Union. The Third Reich entered the war with a critical dependence on oil imports. Its own fields produced only 200,000 tons per year, a drop in the ocean for an industrial machine preparing for world domination. Germany needed at least 7 million tons of petroleum products annually to maintain its military machine at the required level. The gap was catastrophic. The Soviet Union was in a diametrically opposite position. Baku, Grozny, and new fields in the Volga region and western Siberia made the USSR one of the world's largest oil producers. By 1940, the Union was producing more than 30 million tons of oil per year, dozens of times more than Germany. This asymmetry determined the strategic plans of both sides long before the first shot was fired. The German command understood perfectly well that without capturing the Soviet oil fields, a long war was doomed to failure. The Barbarossa plan originally envisaged the lightning capture of the Caucasus and Baku, the Union's main oil artery. But Stalin had his own plans. Soviet intelligence reported on the Reich's critical dependence on fuel supplies. Depriving Germany of oil meant depriving it of its ability to wage war. This idea formed the basis of a long-term strategy that ultimately played a decisive role in the victory over fascism. The fuel war began long before the invasion of the USSR. Already in 1939, with the start of hostilities in Poland, Germany faced the first signs of fuel shortages. The British naval blockade cut off traditional supply routes from Venezuela and the United States. Romanian oil could not meet all the needs of the growing war machine. That is why the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact included not only political, but also economic agreements. Germany desperately needed Soviet fuel, and Moscow was ready to provide it, but on its own terms and in its own interests. Every ton of Soviet oil sold to the Reich gave the USSR strategic time to prepare for the inevitable war. Hitler understood this game, but he had no choice. Without Soviet fuel, his plans for world domination would collapse before they even began. The Führer was forced to play by Stalin's rules, knowing full well that every day of dependence on the USSR brought him closer to a strategic trap. Thus began the invisible war for fuel, a war that determined the outcome of the entire global conflict. Before the Nazis came to power, Germany lived in a state of fuel dependence, which seemed natural and solvable. The Weimar Republic imported about 80% of its oil, mainly from the US, Venezuela, and Romania. German oil companies, primarily Deutsche Erdöl AG, actively developed trade links around the world. The situation changed dramatically with the arrival of Hitler. Autarky, economic self-sufficiency, became one of the cornerstones of Nazi ideology. Heinrich Göring, who gained control of the 4-year economic development plan, set an ambitious goal. By 1940, Germany was to produce 80% of its fuel needs on its own. The reality was harsh. The Reich's own oil production accounted for less than 4% of its needs. The main deposits were located in Lower Saxony and yielded laughable amounts. The Hanover wells, on which high hopes had been pinned, disappointed geologists with their meager yields. The solution was sought in synthetic fuel. The Fischer-Tropsch technology, developed back in the 1920s, made it possible to produce liquid fuel from coal. Germany had plenty of coal. The Ruhr Basin remained one of the largest in Europe. By 1939, there were 12 synthetic fuel plants in the Reich, producing about 4 million tons of gasoline per year. But even that did not solve the problem. Synthetic fuel was 4 times more expensive than conventional fuel and required enormous amounts of electricity. The quality also left much to be desired. Aviation gasoline produced from coal had a low octane rating and was unsuitable for modern combat aircraft. The only option left was to import oil. Romania became the Reich's main supplier. Ploiesti, Romania's oil center, produced about 2 million tons of oil per year, which covered about a third of Germany's needs. But Bucharest dictated harsh terms, demanding German industrial goods and weapons in exchange for oil. Hungary added another 500,000 tons, but its fields were quickly depleted. Attempts to establish supplies from Iraq through German allies failed due to British control of the Suez Canal. Mexican oil was unavailable due to American influence. By the start of the war, Germany found itself in a fuel trap. Its reserves were sufficient for a maximum of 6 months of active combat. Every day of the war required 30,000 tons of fuel, a figure that grew with every new tank and aircraft that rolled off the assembly line. That is why the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact was accompanied by large-scale economic agreements. The USSR pledged to supply the Reich with 900,000 tons of oil per year, a critically important volume for the German war machine. In exchange, Moscow received the latest technology and industrial equipment. Hitler understood perfectly well that this was a temporary solution. Soviet supplies gave him a respite, but did not solve the strategic problem. The only way out was to seize oil fields by force, and the main target, inevitably, became the Soviet Union with its rich reserves of Caucasian oil. August 23, 1939, forever changed the balance of power in Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shocked the world not only with its political agreements, but also with the scale of economic cooperation between 2 ideological enemies. Behind the political declarations lay a tough, pragmatic game. The USSR gained time to prepare for war, while Germany obtained critically needed fuel. The economic agreement signed simultaneously with the pact provided for the supply of Soviet raw materials in exchange for German industrial goods worth 200 million Reichsmarks per year. Oil and petroleum products formed the basis of these supplies. 900,000 tons annually, which covered about 13% of Germany's needs. For the USSR, it was a lucrative deal. Stalin understood perfectly well that war with Germany was inevitable, but every month of peace gave the country an opportunity to strengthen its defenses. Soviet oil supplies were delivered strictly in accordance with the agreements. Not a ton more, not a day earlier. Moscow used the Reich's fuel dependence as a tool of political pressure. The German side received not only the oil itself, but also access to Soviet oil refining technologies. German specialists studied the work of the Baku oil refineries, trying to understand the secrets of Soviet efficiency in processing high-sulfur oil. This knowledge was supposed to help modernize the Reich's own oil refining industry. Supplies were delivered via several routes. The bulk of the oil was transported by rail through Poland. After its partition, this logistics route became more reliable. Some of the oil products were delivered by sea across the Baltic Sea, despite the British blockade. Soviet tankers flying neutral flags broke through to German ports. But Stalin did not limit himself to simple deliveries. Every ton of Soviet oil provided an opportunity to study German needs and plans. Soviet intelligence closely monitored where the delivered fuel was going, to the borders of the USSR or to other theaters of war. Particular attention was paid to the quality of the oil products supplied. The USSR deliberately supplied fuel of lower quality than that used by its own Red Army. The octane rating of Soviet aviation gasoline for Germany was 10 to 15 points lower than the standard. This was not direct sabotage, but it created additional problems for German aviation. In return, Germany supplied the USSR with the latest technology and industrial equipment. The Soviet Union received machine tools, optical instruments, and samples of modern weapons. But here too, the Germans were cautious. The most secret developments remained in the Reich. Technological exchange was limited. By the spring of 1941, economic cooperation had reached its peak. The USSR fulfilled all its delivery obligations, receiving critically important technology and equipment in return. But both sides understood the temporary nature of this cooperation. Hitler used Soviet supplies to build up strategic reserves before attacking the USSR. By June 1941, Germany had fuel reserves for 8 months of active combat operations, largely thanks to Soviet supplies. The irony of history was that the USSR unwittingly helped prepare the aggression against itself. The last train carrying Soviet oil crossed the German border a few hours before the start of Operation Barbarossa. 22 months of economic cooperation ended with cannon fire and the beginning of the battle for the very existence of the Soviet state. At 4 a.m. Moscow time on June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire on Soviet positions. Operation Barbarossa began with one main goal: to swiftly defeat the USSR and seize its oil wealth. The fuel factor became decisive from the very first minutes of the war. Hitler's plan seemed flawless on paper. Army Group South was to rapidly advance to the Dnieper River, then through Ukraine to Rostov-on-Don, and further on to the Caucasian oil fields. It was assumed that the entire operation would take no more than 3 months, and by autumn German tanks would be refueling with Soviet oil in Baku and Grozny. But the reality of war made cruel adjustments to these plans. Already in the first weeks, it became clear that Soviet resistance exceeded all expectations. The Red Army not only did not collapse under the first blows, but also managed to organize a systematic retreat with the evacuation or destruction of strategically important objects. One of the first acts of this tactic was the destruction of oil infrastructure. Soviet engineers, retreating, blew up oil pipelines, burned fuel depots, and disabled oil refineries. Anything that could not be evacuated or destroyed was mined for future demolition. The destruction of Ukrainian oil refineries was particularly painful for the Germans. The Kremenchug plant, one of the largest in the USSR, was blown up by retreating Red Army units. The Germans captured only smoldering ruins, the restoration of which would have required months of work and enormous resources. The German command faced an unexpected problem: growing fuel consumption. The Lightning War was turning into a protracted campaign, and each additional day of fighting required thousands of tons of precious fuel. Guderian and Gotha's tank groups literally devoured gasoline as they advanced deep into Soviet territory. Logistics became a nightmare. The German rear services were not prepared to supply the army over such distances. The Soviet railway network had a different gauge, which required the tracks to be rebuilt or fuel to be transferred. Motor vehicles sank into the Russian mud and got lost in the endless expanses. By the fall of 1941, it was clear that the Blitzkrieg had failed. German troops were bogged down near Moscow, Leningrad, and in battles for Ukraine. The Caucasian oil fields remained out of reach, and fuel reserves in the Reich were rapidly dwindling. The Soviet command used every opportunity to strike at German fuel bases. Partisan detachments were given special assignments to destroy German fuel depots. A single diversion could render an entire tank division combat ineffective for several days. The psychological effect of fuel shortages also affected the morale of German troops. Tank crews, forced to abandon serviceable vehicles due to lack of fuel, lost faith in the invincibility of German weapons. Pilots reduced combat sorties, saving every liter of aviation fuel. Hitler demanded decisive action from his generals to capture the Caucasian oil fields. But reality was relentless. The German army was bogged down in a protracted war for which it was neither materially nor psychologically prepared. The fuel crisis became one of the main factors determining the further course of the campaign. By the end of the first year of the war, it was clear that without the rapid capture of Soviet oil fields, Germany was doomed to defeat in the fuel war. Time was working against the Reich, and every day brought the moment closer when German tanks would be stopped not by enemy shells, but by empty tanks. The Caucasus became a symbol of the struggle for energy dominance in World War II. For Germany, these mountains meant salvation from fuel starvation. For the USSR, the protection of vital oil arteries. The battle for the Caucasus became not just a military operation, but a decisive battle for the energy future of Europe. Baku provided 70% of all Soviet oil. 23 million tons per year was a figure that could completely change the fuel balance of the war. The capture of the Azerbaijani capital meant that the Reich would receive fuel not for months, but for years of war. Hitler understood this and made the Caucasus the main target of the summer campaign of 1942. Operation Edelweiss envisaged a rapid breakthrough through Rostov-on-Don to the foothills of the Caucasus, followed by an advance in two directions, towards Baku along the Caspian coast and towards Batumi via Tbilisi. At the same time, they planned to capture the Maikop oil fields, the second most important oil region in the USSR. The Soviet command prepared for this battle in advance. In the spring of 1942, the evacuation of the most valuable equipment from the Caucasian oil refineries began. Unique catalytic cracking units were dismantled and sent beyond the Urals. Oil industry specialists were evacuated first, but it was impossible to evacuate the oil industry completely. Oil rigs, pipelines, and reservoirs all remained in place. The Soviet leadership made a tough decision. If the Caucasus could not be held, it must be destroyed. The Scorched Earth Plan called for the complete destruction of the region's oil infrastructure. On July 21, 1942, German troops occupied Rostov-on-Don and rushed to the foothills of the Caucasus. The first target was Maikop, the center of oil production in the Kuban region. On August 9, the city fell, but the Germans captured only the smoking ruins of the oil fields. Soviet sappers carried out an exemplary operation to destroy the Maikop oil infrastructure. All wells were blown up or flooded, the oil refinery was destroyed, and warehouses were burned down. It would have taken German engineers at least a year just to restore production, not to mention refining. At the same time, a battle for the mountain passes unfolded. German mountain troops attempted to break through the main Caucasian ridge to the Georgian oil fields. Soviet troops put up desperate resistance, understanding the strategic importance of every height. Particularly fierce fighting broke out for the Klikor Pass. German Alpine troops managed to gain a foothold on the heights, but were unable to advance further. Soviet mountain troops, who knew every trail, methodically drove the enemy out of their positions. The offensive on Baku was already faltering in the foothills. German tank divisions got bogged down in the mountainous terrain, where their technical superiority was useless. Soviet aircraft based at airfields in the Caucasus dealt painful blows to the enemy's stretched communications. By October 1942, it was clear that Operation Edelweiss had failed. Not only did German troops fail to capture the Caucasian oil fields, but they also suffered heavy losses in personnel and equipment. Every day of fighting in the mountains cost the Wehrmacht more than it could gain from the captured fields. The defeat in the Caucasus had catastrophic consequences for the German fuel strategy. The Reich finally lost all hope of obtaining cheap Soviet oil. All that remained was expensive synthetic fuel and limited Romanian supplies, which were clearly insufficient for a long war. For the USSR, the successful defense of the Caucasus meant the preservation of its energy independence. Oil from Baku continued to flow to the front, providing fuel for Soviet tanks and aircraft. The energy war was won by the Red Army long before the final victory over fascism. The failure of the Blitzkrieg presented the German command with a cruel dilemma. How to supply the army with fuel in a protracted war. The capture of Soviet oil fields remained the only real opportunity to solve the Reich's fuel problem. Every month of delay brought the energy catastrophe closer. German geologists had been carefully studying the Soviet oil industry even before the war. Secret maps of fields, data on well productivity, oil pipeline diagrams, all this information had been gathered by German intelligence for years. By the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht had detailed plans for the capture of every major oil facility in the USSR. Special hopes were pinned on the Oil Brigade, a special unit of German petroleum engineers created to quickly restore captured fields. It included the best specialists from German oil companies with experience working in various climatic conditions. The first trophies proved disappointing. The Drohobych fields in western Ukraine, captured in the first days of the war, yielded negligible amounts, about 50,000 tons per year. This would have been enough to supply a single tank division, but not nearly enough to solve the Reich's strategic problem. More serious hopes were pinned on Ukraine. Intelligence reported promising structures in the Dnieper-Donetsk basin, where Soviet geologists were conducting active exploration work. German specialists hoped to find new large deposits here and start developing them. The reality turned out to be harsh. During their retreat, Soviet geologists destroyed all exploration materials, and the wells were either blown up or flooded. Restoring exploration work from scratch would have taken months, which the Germans did not have. They placed particular emphasis on the North Caucasus. In the pre-war years, the Maikop oil fields produced about 2 million tons of oil annually, a volume that could have significantly eased the Reich's fuel situation. The capture of this region became one of the main objectives of the summer offensive of 1942. But here too, the Germans were in for a bitter disappointment. Soviet sappers carried out an exemplary operation to destroy the oil infrastructure. All the wells were rendered unusable, and the oil refinery was razed to the ground. German engineers found that restoring production would require capital investment and at least a year of work. Attempts to quickly restore the Maikop oil fields failed. German drilling rigs delivered from Romania proved unsuitable for local geological conditions. Soviet oil lay at great depths and required special extraction technologies. Sabotage became another problem. The local population that remained in the occupied territory did everything possible to hinder the restoration work. Partisan units regularly attacked German oil facilities, destroying equipment and killing specialists. The loss of skilled personnel was particularly painful. German oil workers in the occupied territories were constantly under attack. By the end of 1942, the Oil Brigade had lost more than half of its personnel, mainly the most experienced specialists. Climatic conditions added to the difficulties. The harsh Caucasian winters halted drilling operations for months. German equipment, designed for European conditions, broke down at temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius. By the spring of 1943, it was clear that the plan to seize Soviet oil had failed completely. During 2 years of occupation, the Germans were unable to establish any significant production in the occupied territories. Instead of the expected millions of tons of oil, the Reich received only additional problems and losses. The failure of the oil strategy in the East meant that Germany was doomed to fuel shortages. The only hope remained synthetic factories and Romanian supplies, clearly insufficient to wage war on several fronts at once. When it became clear that capturing Soviet oil would not be possible, Germany turned to its last trump card: synthetic fuel. The technology for producing liquid fuel from coal, developed by German chemists in the 1920s, was supposed to save the Reich from an energy catastrophe. But reality proved more complicated than theoretical calculations. The history of German synthetic fuel began with the work of Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. In 1925, they patented a process for converting synthesis gas into liquid hydrocarbons. The technology seemed revolutionary. Germany, with its huge coal reserves, could become energy independent. The first industrial synthetic fuel plant was built by Sasol in 1935 in León. Its capacity was only 100,000 tons per year, but it was an important step towards energy self-sufficiency. The Nazi leadership saw synthetics as a way to free Germany from its dependence on imports. Göring's four-year plan envisaged the large-scale development of the synthetic fuel industry. By 1940, it was planned to build 12 large plants with a total capacity of 4 million tons per year. The investment was enormous, about 2 billion Reichsmarks. The largest center for synthetic fuel was Lüneburg in Saxony-Anhalt. This gigantic complex, managed by the IG Farben industry concern, produced 700,000 tons of synthetic gasoline annually by the beginning of the war. The plant ran on local brown coal and consumed enormous amounts of electricity. The technological process was extremely complex. The coal was first gasified at a temperature of about 1,000 degrees Celsius. The resulting synthesis gas was purified of impurities and then converted into liquid hydrocarbons under high pressure and temperature. The entire cycle required highly skilled specialists and precise adherence to technological parameters. The quality of the synthetic fuel left much to be desired. The octane rating of synthetic gasoline barely reached 70, compared to 95 for American aviation fuel. This created serious problems for German aviation, whose aircraft lost power and reliability. The cost of production was catastrophically high. A ton of synthetic gasoline cost 4 times more than imported oil. Under peaceful conditions, such production would have been unprofitable. But war dictated its own rules. Germany was ready to pay any price for energy independence. By 1942, there were 14 synthetic fuel plants operating in the Reich. They produced about 6 million tons of various petroleum products per year, half of the German military's total needs. Synthetics became the basis of the Reich's fuel balance. But this system had a critical vulnerability: centralization of production. Most of the plants were located in Saxony and Silesia, within reach of Allied aircraft. German engineers understood this problem, but decentralizing production required time and resources that were not available. Special hopes were pinned on underground factories. In Harz and other mountainous areas, the Germans began building underground synthetic fuel plants, protected from bombing by thick layers of rock. But these projects required enormous costs and could not be completed within a reasonable time frame. The quality of the workforce steadily deteriorated. Experienced German engineers were drafted into the army and replaced by foreign workers and prisoners of war, who lacked the necessary qualifications. Labor productivity fell, and the number of accidents increased. By 1943, the Reich's synthetic fuel industry had reached its peak. But this peak coincided with the start of massive Allied bombing raids, which were intended to destroy Germany's last hope for energy independence. Synthetic fuel did not save the Reich. High cost, low quality, and vulnerability to airstrikes made this technology a temporary solution, unable to replace the enemy's captured oil. When hopes of capturing Soviet oil collapsed and synthetic production faced growing problems, Germany was forced to rely on its Eastern European allies. Romania and Hungary became the last sources of natural oil for the dying Reich. But these sources also proved limited and vulnerable. Romanian oil was the main hope of the German war machine. By the start of the war, the Ploiesti fields were producing about 6 million tons of oil per year, a significant portion of European production. German companies had invested in the Romanian oil industry in the 1930s, gaining control over most of the fields. But the Romanian allies dictated harsh terms. Bucharest demanded modern weapons, industrial equipment, and political guarantees in exchange for oil. Every ton of Romanian oil cost the Reich more and more, not only in money, but also in strategic resources. The quality of Romanian oil also posed problems. Its high sulfur content required complex processing, and Romanian refineries were not always able to cope with the task. Germany had to either put up with low-quality fuel or process Romanian oil at its own plants. Transportation became a bottleneck. The only reliable route from Romania to the Reich was via the Danube, but this river froze in winter and was subject to Allied air attacks in summer. Rail transport was limited by capacity and also became a target for bombing. Hungarian oil added another 500,000 tons per year to Romanian supplies. The fields near the town of Nadcaniza were small but strategically important. They were closer to the German border and less vulnerable to airstrikes. But Hungarian reserves were rapidly depleted. Intensive wartime exploitation led to a decline in well production. By 1944, Hungarian production had halved, depriving the Reich of another source of natural fuel. The political situation in the region was becoming increasingly unstable. Romanian dictator Antonescu was balancing between German demands and growing discontent among his own people. Hungarian regent Horthy was also showing increasing independence from Berlin. The issue of prisoners of war and forced labor became particularly painful. Germany demanded not only oil from its allies, but also labor for its military factories. Romania and Hungary were reluctant to make these concessions, which created additional tension in relations. Technical problems snowballed. German equipment supplied to Romania and Hungary was often outdated or substandard. The Allies received what the Germans could not use themselves. Oil production in the region gradually declined. The Soviet offensive of 1944 threatened the entire Eastern European oil system. The Red Army was approaching the Romanian border, and the local population was increasingly expressing anti-German sentiments. Attempts to evacuate oil equipment from Romania and Hungary began too late. Most of the valuable installations were captured by Soviet troops or destroyed by retreating Germans. The Reich lost not only oil but also the technology to extract and process it. The August coup in Romania in 1944 finally deprived Germany of Eastern European oil. King Michael arrested Antonescu and declared war on the Reich. The Ploiești oil fields came under the control of the new allies of the USSR. By the fall of 1944, the German fuel system had collapsed completely. Romanian and Hungarian oil was lost. Synthetic factories were destroyed by Allied airstrikes, and domestic production remained negligible. The Reich entered the last year of the war with virtually no fuel. The limitations of Eastern European sources became abundantly clear. They could only delay the Reich's energy catastrophe, but not prevent it. Germany lost the fuel war long before its surrender in Berlin. The first day of August 1943 was a dark day for the German fuel industry. 178 American Liberator bombers took off from airfields in North Africa, heading for Ploiești, the heart of the Romanian oil industry. Operation Torpedo opened a new front in the fuel war. The Allies finally understood the strategic importance of oil infrastructure for the Reich's war machine. An analysis of the German economy revealed a critical dependence on a limited number of large facilities. The destruction of several key plants could paralyze the enemy's entire fuel system. The Ploiești raid was the first attempt at strategic bombing of oil facilities. Despite heavy losses, 54 aircraft shot down, the Americans proved the vulnerability of German fuel sources. Romanian oil refineries burned for several days, and production fell by 40%. But the real turning point came in the spring of 1944. On May 12, Operation Point Blank began. Systematic bombing of the German synthetic fuel industry. The main target was a giant complex in Luna, the largest producer of synthetic fuel in the Reich. The first raid on Luna was carried out by 935 American B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers. The accuracy of the bombing was unprecedented. All key installations at the plant were hit directly. Synthetic fuel production fell from 700,000 to 100,000 tons per month. The German command understood the catastrophic consequences of these strikes. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, reported to Hitler that the loss of the synthetic fuel plants meant the end of the war within 4 months. All resources were thrown into rebuilding the destroyed factories. German engineers performed miracles of organization. Using forced labor from prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, they rebuilt the destroyed facilities in a matter of weeks. But the Allies returned, again and again, methodically destroying every facility that was rebuilt. The night raids by the Royal Air Force were particularly painful. British Lancasters dropped 4-ton tallboy bombs on German factories, capable of penetrating any defense. Underground workshops and armored tanks were no match for these monstrous munitions. The Reich's air defense system was unable to cope with the massive raids. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters suffered heavy losses, and their pilots were not sufficiently trained due to a lack of aviation fuel. It was a vicious circle. The lack of fuel made it impossible to defend the factories that produced it. By the fall of 1944, synthetic fuel production in the Reich had fallen by 80%. Of the 14 large factories, only 2 were operating normally. The rest were either in ruins or producing negligible amounts of low-quality fuel. Attempts to decentralize production failed. The construction of numerous small factories required time and resources that the Reich did not have. Underground facilities were being built too slowly and could not compensate for the loss of above-ground facilities. The psychological effect of the bombings was no less important than the material damage. German workers and engineers were losing faith in the Reich's ability to protect them. Sabotage and passive resistance became widespread in the remaining factories. Fuel shortages affected all aspects of the German war machine. Tank divisions received half their usual fuel rations. The Air Force reduced combat sorties to a minimum, and the Navy virtually ceased active operations. The great German army was suffocating without fuel. The Allies continued their systematic destruction of the fuel infrastructure until the very end of the war. Every facility that was restored was immediately subjected to repeated strikes. By the spring of 1945, synthetic fuel production in the Reich had virtually ceased. The air campaign against the German fuel industry became one of the most successful strategic operations of World War II. The Allies deprived the enemy of the ability to resist without landing a single soldier on Reich territory. The fuel shortage hastened Germany's surrender by several months. By the end of 1944, fuel shortages had affected all levels of the German military machine. What began as a strategic problem turned into a disaster that paralyzed the Wehrmacht's combat effectiveness. For the first time, German generals were faced with a situation where serviceable equipment was rendered useless due to empty fuel tanks. The tank forces were the first and hardest hit. The Panzer Grenadier divisions, the pride of the German army, received half the standard amount of fuel. The Tigers and Panthers, the most powerful tanks in the world, stood idle in shelters, turning into immobile firing points. The situation with the newest Königstiger tanks was particularly tragic. These 100-ton monsters consumed 3 times more fuel than ordinary panzers, but their combat value was exceptional. Tank unit commanders faced a painful choice: use 1 Königstiger or 3 medium tanks. The Reich's Air Force effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Fighter groups, which had recently dominated the European skies, were grounded by a lack of aviation fuel. Pilots were given flight time in minutes rather than hours, making normal training impossible. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters, which were technically superior to all Allied aircraft, fell victim to the fuel crisis. Their turbines consumed huge amounts of kerosene, but the production of jet fuel had been virtually shut down due to the bombing of synthetic fuel plants. The Reich's Navy turned into a museum. Submarines, which just a year earlier had struck terror into Allied convoys, rotted in ports without diesel fuel. The last cruisers and destroyers of the Kriegsmarine were used as floating coastal defense batteries. The Wehrmacht's logistics system collapsed completely. Supply trucks received barely a third of the fuel they needed. Rail transport was intermittent, with locomotives being converted to wood and low-quality coal, which drastically reduced their efficiency. The Reich's civilian economy was suffocating without energy. Factories were operating on a reduced schedule, and many enterprises had shut down completely. Agriculture returned to the days of horse-drawn plows, tractors stood idle without fuel, and crops were harvested by hand. The transport collapse paralyzed the entire country. Car traffic practically ceased. Gasoline was only available with special coupons for critical trips. Public transport operated sporadically, and cities were plunged into medieval isolation. The eastern regions of the Reich were particularly hard hit. The Silesian industrial centers, deprived of fuel, were unable to evacuate their equipment before the advancing Red Army. The most valuable machines and equipment fell into the hands of the Soviet troops in working order. The morale of the troops plummeted. Soldiers saw their equipment turn into scrap metal without fuel. Faith in miracle weapons evaporated when it became clear that even the most advanced tanks and aircraft were useless without fuel. The command tried to compensate for the fuel shortage with tactical innovations. Tanks were used in ambushes, aircraft performed only the most critical tasks, and the fleet switched to mine warfare. But these measures could only delay the inevitable defeat. The black market for fuel flourished even under total control. The price of a liter of gasoline reached the cost of a kilogram of gold. Corruption eroded what remained of discipline. Officers sold military fuel to provide food for their families. By the spring of 1945, the German army was a pitiful sight. Divisions existed only on paper, and only a few units that received fuel on a priority basis had any real combat value. The rest of the troops were doomed to passive defense. The fuel shortage hastened the collapse of the Third Reich by several months. If Germany had had enough fuel, the war could have dragged on until the summer of 1945. But the energy blockade made resistance pointless. The paradox was that the Reich still had the human resources and industrial capacity to continue the war. But without fuel, all this power turned into a pile of useless metal. Germany lost the war not on the battlefield, but in the oil fields. On December 16, 1944, Hitler threw the remnants of his strategic reserves into a last desperate attack. Operation Watch on the Rhine, an offensive in the Ardennes, was supposed to turn the tide of the war on the Western Front. But the main obstacle for the German troops was not the enemy, but a catastrophic fuel shortage. The plan looked grandiose on paper. 3 armies, 25 divisions, including the Reich's best tank units, were to break through the American defenses in the Ardennes and reach the port of Antwerp. Capturing the main Allied supply base could have radically changed the situation in the West. But the fuel situation was critical. The German command had fuel for only 4 days of active combat. The plan was based on capturing American fuel depots. Without this, the offensive was doomed to failure from the outset. The 1st SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, played a special role in the operation. Its striking force was the Königstiegers, the most powerful tanks in the world. But each of these monsters consumed 300 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. With fuel in short supply, this was an unaffordable luxury. On the morning of December 16, German artillery opened fire on American positions. The surprise was complete. The Allies did not expect a major offensive in winter conditions. The first hours of the operation went according to plan, with German tanks breaking through the enemy's front lines. But by the end of the first day, fatal problems had emerged. The tank columns had used up most of their fuel, and the promised replenishment did not arrive. The mountainous and wooded terrain of the Ardennes proved impassable for heavy refuelers. The roads turned into a slushy mess. The fate of Piper's combat group from the 1st SS Panzer Division was particularly tragic. These elite units were the first to break through to the American rear. But 2 days later, they were left without fuel deep in enemy territory. The SS tankers were forced to abandon all their equipment and fight their way back on foot. The American fuel depots that the Germans had hoped to capture had either been evacuated or destroyed. The Allied command quickly understood the German strategy and methodically deprived the enemy of the opportunity to replenish their fuel supplies. German air support was symbolic. The Luftwaffe managed to get only 200 aircraft into the air, a pitiful remnant of the once formidable air force. Most of the fighters remained on the ground due to a lack of aviation fuel. By December 20th, it was clear that the offensive was running out of steam. German tank wedges were bogged down in American defenses, lacking fuel for maneuver. Immobile Panthers and Tigers became targets for Allied aircraft and artillery. The weather, which had initially favored the Germans, turned against them. The fog cleared, and Allied aircraft were able to launch massive strikes against German columns. Every surviving tanker became a priority target for fighter bombers. The morale of the German troops collapsed when it became clear that the operation had failed. The soldiers saw their tanks being turned into scrap metal, not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The last illusions about miracle weapons were finally dispelled. By New Year's Eve, German troops began to retreat. In 2 weeks of fighting, the Reich lost its last strategic reserves: 700 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and 100,000 soldiers. But most importantly, all hope for a turning point in the war was finally lost. The Ardennes offensive was the last major operation of the German ground forces. After this defeat, the Wehrmacht could only defend itself, gradually retreating under the blows of a superior enemy. Fuel shortages made any active operations impossible. The irony of history was that German industry was still producing tanks and aircraft. But without fuel, all this equipment was useless. The Third Reich was suffocating in its own achievements, deprived of its energy base. The Watch on the Rhine demonstrated the final bankruptcy of German military strategy. Even the most sophisticated weapons and the best soldiers in the world could not compensate for the lack of basic fuel. The War of Engines was irretrievably lost by the Reich. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched its final strategic offensive of the war. The Vistula-Oder operation was not only a military triumph for the USSR, but also the final solution to the Reich's fuel problem. Soviet troops methodically captured German fuel depots, depriving the enemy of its last chances of resistance. The Soviet command understood the importance of fuel. Intelligence reported on the critical fuel situation in the German army. Each warehouse captured brought final victory closer, and each tanker destroyed reduced the enemy's resistance. Particular attention was paid to the Silesian industrial region. This was where the Reich's last functioning synthetic fuel plants were located, as well as its largest fuel depots. The capture of Silesia meant that the German army would be completely deprived of energy resources. The offensive developed rapidly. Soviet Tank Corps, finally receiving sufficient fuel, advanced at a speed of 50 kilometers per day. German troops were unable to organize an effective defense. They simply did not have enough fuel to maneuver. The actions of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, under the command of Ribalko, were particularly successful. Its units were the first to break into the Silesian industrial centers, capturing tens of thousands of tons of synthetic fuel. These trophies made it possible to maintain the pace of the offensive without pausing for supplies. The German command tried to evacuate or destroy fuel reserves, but time was running out. The Soviet advance units moved faster than the Germans could organize the destruction of the warehouses. Most of the fuel fell intact into the hands of the Red Army. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers saw Soviet tanks refueling with their own fuel, captured from Wehrmacht warehouses. The symbolism of what was happening was obvious. The Reich could not even protect its own resources. The capture of the Upper Silesian industrial region was a disaster for the German fuel system. 20% of all synthetic fuel in the Reich was produced here. Soviet engineers quickly repaired the damaged equipment and directed its output to the needs of the Red Army. German synthetic fuel production technology proved to be a particularly valuable trophy. Soviet specialists gained access to the most advanced methods of converting coal into liquid fuel. This knowledge proved useful to the USSR in the post-war development of its chemical industry. Romanian and Hungarian oil fields also came under Soviet control. The Ploiesti oil fields, which had supplied the Reich for so many years, began to work for the Red Army. The irony of history was that the Soviet troops received the oil that their enemies had tried to deprive the USSR of. The German army's logistics system collapsed completely. Soviet troops cut off all major communications, depriving scattered German units of fuel. Wehrmacht tank divisions were turned into infantry divisions due to a lack of fuel. The fate of the German tank reserves in Hungary was particularly telling. The 6th SS Panzer Army, transferred from the Ardennes to defend the Hungarian oil fields, was left without fuel after the Soviet breakthrough. Elite SS divisions were defeated, unable even to organize a retreat. The Red Army's air superiority became absolute. Soviet aviation had enough fuel for massive strikes, while the Luftwaffe had practically ceased flying. The ratio of forces in the air reached 50-1 in favor of the USSR. German attempts to organize counterattacks failed due to a lack of fuel. Tank divisions that existed on paper had only a dozen serviceable vehicles in reality. Wehrmacht commanders openly admitted that it was impossible to carry out combat missions. By March 1945, Soviet troops controlled all the main oil-producing regions of Eastern Europe. Germany was completely cut off from external sources of fuel. The remnants of the Reich existed on meager reserves accumulated in the depths of the country. The strategic significance of the Soviet successes went far beyond military victories. The USSR gained control over the energy resources of all of Eastern Europe. This determined the post-war balance of power in the region and laid the foundations for Soviet influence for decades to come. The fuel war was won by the Red Army, completely and unconditionally. Germany lost not only the ability to continue its resistance, but also the energy base for post-war reconstruction. The seizure of oil resources became one of the decisive factors in the final victory of the USSR. By the time Germany surrendered, the fuel blockade had completely achieved its goal. The Reich, which had once claimed world domination, was dying of energy depletion. Fuel production and consumption figures told the story of defeat more eloquently than any military report. In 1944, Germany produced only 3 million tons of synthetic fuel, compared to 6 million in 1943. Allied bombing halved production, and the capture of Silesia by Soviet troops completed the destruction of the Reich's fuel system. Romanian supplies, which formed the basis of German imports, ceased after the coup on August 23, 1944. 2 million tons of oil per year, a critically important volume, disappeared from the Reich's fuel balance overnight. Germany's own oil production remained symbolic. 200,000 tons per year by the end of the war. This was enough to supply one tank division for a month. Wartime geological surveys did not discover any new fields of any significant size. The German military machine's needs were estimated at 10 million tons of fuel per year to conduct active combat operations. By 1945, actual production and imports did not exceed 1 million tons. A tenfold deficit made resistance pointless. The situation with aviation fuel was particularly catastrophic. The Luftwaffe needed at least 700,000 tons of aviation gasoline per year to maintain combat readiness. In the last months of the war, production did not exceed 50,000 tons, 14 times less than the demand. By May 1945, the Reich's tank forces had fuel for 3 days of combat. Strategic fuel reserves were completely exhausted. Even the most modern Königstiger and Jagdtiger tanks stood motionless in their shelters. The economic losses from the fuel blockade were estimated at tens of billions of Reichsmarks. The halt of transport paralyzed trade. The closure of factories deprived the Reich of industrial production, and agriculture returned to 19th-century methods. human losses were no less significant. Tens of thousands of oil industry specialists were killed in Allied bombing raids. Hundreds of thousands of workers were left unemployed after the closure of fuel plants. Millions of Reich citizens were deprived of normal transportation. The strategic consequences of the fuel blockade went far beyond military defeat. Germany lost its energy independence for decades to come. The destroyed fuel infrastructure required enormous investments to rebuild. The Soviet Union, on the contrary, emerged from the war with a stronger energy position. The preservation of the Caucasian oil fields, the capture of Eastern European resources, and the acquisition of German technology made the USSR an energy superpower. The Allies also learned important lessons from the fuel war. Strategic bombing of oil infrastructure proved more effective than the destruction of cities. The energy blockade became a new form of warfare. The figures for German aviation losses spoke eloquently of the role of fuel. Of the 39,000 aircraft produced during the war, 20,000 were lost not in combat, but due to accidents and a lack of fuel for pilot training. The Reich's navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force in 1944. Submarines, once formidable gray wolves, rotted in ports without diesel fuel. Of the 1,000 submarines built, only a few remained in service by the end of the war. The psychological impact of fuel shortages on the Reich's population was devastating. Germans saw their country returning to the pre-industrial era. Faith in the 1,000-year Reich evaporated along with the last drops of gasoline. Post-war Germany inherited a catastrophic energy legacy. Divided for decades, the country spent decades rebuilding its destroyed fuel system. Energy dependence became one of the main problems of the German economy. The fuel blockade demonstrated the decisive role of energy resources in modern warfare. Without oil and coal, even the most sophisticated military machine is reduced to scrap metal. This truth shaped the geopolitical map of the world for decades to come. Post-war historians and publicists created many myths surrounding the Third Reich's fuel strategy. Some claimed that Germany could have won the war with better planning of its oil resources. Others blamed the defeat solely on fuel shortages. Time allows us to soberly assess the real capabilities and mistakes of the Nazi leadership. The most common myth is that Hitler did not understand the importance of oil for modern warfare. Archival documents refute this claim. The Führer was well aware of the fuel problem and repeatedly stated that, without oil, Germany cannot wage war. The problem was not one of understanding, but of impossibility. Another legend claims that the capture of the Caucasus would have guaranteed the Reich victory in the war. Analysis shows that this opinion is mistaken. Even complete control over Soviet oil would not have solved Germany's strategic problems. Transporting Caucasian oil to the Reich would have taken months, and Soviet troops would have continued their resistance. The myth of miracle fuel also does not stand up to scrutiny. German scientists did indeed work on alternative fuels, alcohol, methane, even wood gas. But none of these technologies could replace oil on an industrial scale. The energy density of alternative fuels was too low. The myth of the betrayal of the Romanians proved particularly persistent. According to this version, King Michael and his supporters deprived the Reich of victory by switching sides to the Allies in August 1944. The reality was different. Romanian deposits were depleted, and their production could not meet German needs. Some authors claim that Germany possessed secret technologies for producing synthetic fuel that could have changed the course of the war. A study of German archives does not confirm these fantasies. The Fischer-Tropsch process was well known and did not undergo any revolutionary modifications. The myth of Allied sabotage also needs to be debunked. According to this version, British and American agents infiltrated German factories and sabotaged fuel production. In reality, the main damage was caused by aerial bombing, not sabotage. The legend of Hitler's fuel reserves arose from a misinterpretation of documents. Some historians claimed that the Führer was hiding huge reserves of fuel for the final battle. The reality was prosaic. By the end of the war, the Reich did not have any significant reserves. The myth of oil diplomacy also does not correspond to the facts. Germany was supposedly able to gain access to Middle Eastern oil through an alliance with Arab leaders, but geographical and political realities made this impossible. British control of the Suez Canal blocked any supplies. The myth of a Soviet-German fuel conspiracy is particularly absurd. Some authors claim that Stalin and Hitler secretly agreed to divide the world's oil resources. Documents show the opposite. Each side tried to use the other for its own interests. The legend of miracle weapons is also linked to fuel issues. Jet aircraft, V-1 rockets, and the latest tanks all required special types of fuel that the Reich did not have. Technological advances proved useless without an energy base. The myth of the fuel alternative suggests that Germany could have reoriented its economy toward electricity and coal. But the structure of military technology in the 1940s required liquid fuel. Electric tanks and coal-powered aircraft existed only in the imagination. The reality was harsh and prosaic. Germany entered the war without sufficient energy resources and was unable to solve this problem by military means. No diplomatic maneuvers, technological breakthroughs, or strategic tricks could compensate for the fundamental lack of oil. A sober analysis shows that the fuel problem was insoluble for the Reich in the context of the war it was waging. The aggression against the USSR deprived Germany of its last major source of oil. There was no alternative, either geographically or technologically. Studying myths is important for understanding the real reasons for Germany's defeat. The fuel factor was critical, but not the only one. The Reich lost the war on all fronts, militarily, economically, and politically. The oil shortage only hastened the inevitable defeat of the totalitarian system. The fuel war of World War II left an indelible mark on the geopolitical map of the world. The struggle for energy resources that unfolded between 1939 and 1945 determined the balance of power for decades to come. The victors and the vanquished drew different lessons from this experience. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as an energy superpower. The preservation of the Caucasian oil fields, the seizure of Eastern European resources, and the acquisition of German synthetic fuel technology created a powerful foundation for post-war development. The USSR became not only a producer, but also an exporter of energy resources. Control over Eastern European oil fields proved particularly important. The Romanian fields of Ploiești, the Hungarian fields of Nadkanisha, and Polish resources all came under Soviet influence. Energy dependence became a tool for political control over the region. Germany was divided and deprived of its energy independence. The destroyed fuel infrastructure took decades to rebuild. West Germany became dependent on American and Middle Eastern oil, while East Germany became dependent on Soviet supplies. The energy divide deepened the political split in the country. The Allies learned important strategic lessons. Bombing oil infrastructure proved more effective than destroying cities and factories. Energy blockades became a new form of warfare, which developed in post-war conflicts. The Middle East region took on particular significance. The war demonstrated the critical importance of oil resources for national security. The United States began an active policy in the region aimed at ensuring stable oil supplies. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan had a pronounced energy component. The technological consequences of the war were also significant. The Soviet Union gained access to German synthetic fuel technologies and began developing them. The Americans focused on exploring new deposits and improving extraction methods. The technological race in the energy sector became part of the Cold War. The creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact had an energy background. The Western Bloc sought to secure oil supplies from the Middle East to Europe. The Eastern Bloc created an autonomous energy system under Soviet control. The development of nuclear energy was also linked to the lessons of the fuel war. The quest for energy independence stimulated research into alternative energy sources. Peaceful use of atomic energy became the answer to the vulnerability of traditional energy sources. Decolonization in the post-war period took place against the backdrop of the growing importance of oil resources. Newly independent states in Africa and Asia used control over energy resources as a tool to put pressure on their former colonial powers. Nationalization of the oil industry became a global trend. The creation of OPEC in 1960 was a direct consequence of the lessons of World War II. Oil-producing countries understood the strategic importance of their resources and united to coordinate their policies. Energy became a weapon in the arsenal of international diplomacy. The Cold War was largely a struggle for control over the world's energy resources. The Soviet Union used oil and gas supplies to expand its influence. The United States created alternative supply systems for its allies. The environmental consequences of the fuel war only became apparent decades later. The massive use of synthetic fuels, the burning of oil fields, and environmental pollution all created long-term problems for the regions where the fighting took place. The energy policies of the leading powers today still bear the imprint of the lessons of World War II. The quest for energy security, diversification of supply sources, and the creation of strategic reserves are all principles that were born during the fuel war. The Russian Federation, as the successor to the USSR, inherited the status of an energy superpower. Oil and gas resources remain the most important tool of Russian foreign policy. Energy diplomacy continues the traditions established during the war. The lessons of the fuel war of 1939 to 1945 remain relevant today. Energy security continues to determine the national power of states. The struggle for control over energy resources continues in new forms, but with the same intensity as 80 years ago.